Hi, my name's Nick Barker, and this talk is about intuitive education games. So just a high-level summary, if you don't have the time to watch the entire talk, play is about learning. We all play as children. Most intelligent animals have been observed playing, and the purpose of play is to build up an understanding of the rules and the limitations of your own body and the world in a safe environment. Right? You practice things that you're going to do in the real world with play so that you're not doing them for the first time when you actually have to do them for real. Right? And very recently, in evolutionary terms, humans have invented video games, which are essentially play but on steroids. They allow us to play in environments that are way beyond the limitations of what we would be able to do in the physical world. And just like the play that we did in the past, we learn so much about the environment inside video games and the systems that they use when we play video games, right? So why not use video games to learn real skills? Intuitive education games are essentially just video games that are carefully aligned with real-world systems so that by playing them and having fun, the player subconsciously learns something relevant to real-world knowledge or skills while playing them. So just some introduction and background. In general, people seem to understand the potential for education in games. If you speak to people and you talk to them about the future of education, they tend to mention gamification often, right? People seem to accept that at some point we'll figure out a more highly motivating way to do education, but I would argue that we haven't quite really figured it out. Like imagination for what really could exist in this space is kind of limited, and we can't really say that there's been really significant developments in educational games in the last 30 or 40 years. They all kind of end up turning out like interactive textbooks. And in general, education games don't tend to be critically acclaimed or highly successful compared to just straight games, right? And I think one of the reasons for that is that we view education and fun as these oppositional, mutually exclusive concepts, and that we have to choose one of them, right? And if we're going to choose one and we're making an educational game, people generally say it's better that the game is educational and not fun rather than the other way around, because if it's fun and not educational, it's just a game, right? So what I'm going to talk about in this talk is maybe we can get both of them together in one package, but how do we design things so that we can make games that are both educational and fun? And I think before we start to look into that, we have to think about what is actually happening when we play games, right? When we play, what's going on in our brains and in our environment? And if you've ever owned like a pet, like a kitten or a puppy, a baby pet, they love to play, right? And the thing is that the majority of intelligent animals have actually been observed playing in the wild. The strange thing is, of course, that play is very physically intensive, right? It uses a lot of resources, uses a lot of energy. And so there has to be a very strong evolutionary incentive for the existence of play, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't waste all this resources, all this food for no reason, right? And so one of the big prevailing theories around why play is found across all of these different species is because it allows animals, when they're small, in a safe environment to measure and understand the limitations and the rules of their own bodies and the environment that they live in so that they can extrapolate that to real situations later on. If you've ever watched a cat playing, and either a kitten or an adult cat with one of those fishing rod toys, or if you've ever seen a cat, try to catch a bird, they so obviously have an intimate understanding of motion and flight. They can predict where the object's going to end up. If you ever drop a cat or you see a cat fall, they end up on their feet because they're very good at being able to manipulate their bodies to twist in the air, right? But of course, in the sense that we think about education, cats don't understand physics, right? They can't understand physics from an equations perspective. And it's the same kind of thing with children, with most children at least. They can't explain the rules behind projectile motion, but if you watch them when they start to learn to play sport, they're obviously figuring out how to apply force at a certain angle with a certain rotation in order to, make a ball go where they want it to. And being able to subconsciously observe the rules of the environment that you're in and running small experiments and building up that understanding so that you can manipulate it with your body, that type of thing. This is generally what we refer to as intuition, right? The ability to do something without necessarily understanding logically how it actually works. Now, as we extrapolate that out to games, right, we start to see that video games are essentially the same as the play that we engage in as children or the animals engage in. It's just amped up to the next level, right? It's a very recent development using modern technology, and as a result, we're able to take play way, way further than we are able to in the wild, Video games allow us to play at an immense scale, way bigger than we'd ever see normally. They allow us to play in situations that would be way too dangerous or even completely, paradoxical or impossible in real life. They allow us to push our boundaries of play way further than we could otherwise. Everything from, pure fantasy, with orcs, trolls, that type of thing, through to like future sci-fi fantasy, dystopian, alternate realities, post-apocalypse, that type of stuff. And then all the way on the other end, we have, like simulation games that allow us to fly jets and launch rockets or even manage a football team, that type of thing. Doing things in a way that allows us to do it safely and, importantly, cheaply with very few resources. You don't need to buy your own football team in order to practice managing a football team playing Football Manager, right? And the most important thing to recognize here is that because video games are just an extension of the type of play that we normally do, they're constantly teaching us things about the world that they're set in, right? As you play games more often for more hours, you develop a stronger intuition. Well, usually you develop a stronger intuition for how the games work. And it's because your brain is running all these tiny little experiments, performing inputs, seeing what outputs it gets back, and it's building up this big neural web of probability of what will happen given what conditions, right? We develop a deeper intuition and understanding of the world that the game is set in, to the extent where if you play through a game once and then you watch your friend play through it, you're probably able to give them some really good tips like, that monster's probably too strong for you, or there's probably going to be some treasure over there, that kind of thing. Even if you don't remember the exact location, you've built up an intuition for the systems and the world that the game is set in, right? Even if you can't explain, here's the precise formula for the damage that monsters do, right? You can probably guess that the monster's too strong. And that's your intuition kicking in. So when we talk about intuitive education games, I think it's important first for us to try and explicitly define what I'm referring to, and then we'll start to look into the mechanics and think about how we can try and design intuitive education games. So it's worth pointing out at this point that in general, the systems that exist in games that we play aren't aligned with systems in the real world, right? You can, for example, if you play a first-person shooting game, that's not likely to make you better at shooting a real gun, right? I'm sure if you went to a firing range and tried to shoot a real gun, it would be incredibly different to playing Counter-Strike, right? That's a good thing in that case, right? So intuitive education games are essentially games where the player picks up knowledge or understanding of a real-world concept as a side effect of playing the game for fun, right? So they're not specifically educational games, but as you play the game and you enjoy it for fun, you actually pick up some real-world skill, not an imaginary skill or not knowledge of an imaginary world of a real thing. So we can define intuitive education games with two specific criteria. The first one is that, of course, the player needs to learn some kind of real-world skill or knowledge as a result of playing the game. And the second one is that the main focus of the game can't be the learning itself, right? This is really important. It needs to be fun and engaging as a standalone, even if the player isn't interested in learning at all. Right? Even if your game is about teaching people a language, it's not an intuitive education game if they need to be interested in the language in order to actually find the game fun. And you'll know you've succeeded when it's essentially impossible to not learn the skill while playing the game. It just goes in somehow passively. So we're going to look at what the specific mechanics are to actually add intuitive education elements into games. And those two things are knowledge on one hand and understanding on the other. So knowledge-based elements in intuitive education games are essentially about memorization, right? When you align your content in your game with facts in the real world, and when I say content, I mean, weapons, people, dates, places, governments, plants, animals, that type of stuff. When instead of inventing new ones, you align them with real ones in the real world, you can provide a fun environment to help the player memorize things without it really feeling like memorization, right? To give you a specific example, when I was growing up, I played Age of Empires and Age of Empires 2, and the image on the right here is a Chinese repeating crossbow, right? And when I was thinking, what were the games I played as a kid? And I thought of Age of Empires 2, the first thing that came to my mind was this unit in Age of Empires 2 called the Chukonu, right? It's a unit with a crossbow that fires a lot of crossbow bolts really quickly. It's quite a strong unit from what I remember. And it's a special unit that you get when you play the Chinese army. Right? So I remembered Chukonu, and I just went to Google and I typed Chukonu, and the first thing that came up was a Wikipedia article about the Chinese repeating crossbow that was used in like 100 AD, right? So amazingly, something like that, which is a piece of knowledge that actually corresponds to a real historical fact, right? Stuck in my brain for like 20 years. That's how strongly it went in there. And I think, for example, if we'd learned about this in history in school, if I'd done this in primary school and in high school, I'd learned about this, I'm sure it would have gone in one ear and one out and out the other. But for some reason, it feels like it's stuck really strongly. And when I started to dig into the reasoning behind it, what I realized was it's because there was an external motivation for me to actually remember it, right? When you play a game in Age of Empires, it'll show you what the different armies are that you're fighting against. And if you see that someone's playing the Chinese army, you'll know that they'll have these units. And if you don't remember that they have the Chukonu, that could possibly put you at a huge disadvantage because you don't realize that the Chinese army has this special unit that they use. So it's actually providing an externalized motivation to memorize the fact, which isn't just like memorize it and you get an achievement or a tick, which is, I think, a hole that traditional education games tend to fall into. So the second type of education that you can put in your games is understanding. And understanding, contrasted with knowledge, is much, much more powerful but exceptionally difficult to pull off well. And understanding is where you manage to align an entire gameplay system inside your game with a system that exists in the real world. So I'm not just talking about facts and concepts, but I'm talking about the actual rules of the system so that you can interact with it and do experiments and it would behave as if it would behave in the real world. And a really great example of this is redstone circuits in Minecraft. So redstone circuits in Minecraft allow you to automate parts of your constructions, the things that you build. You can make doors automatically open and close, that type of stuff. And it's actually a good, complete representation of logical circuits, right? So if you learn how to build really complex redstone circuits, for example, people have built emulated CPUs inside Minecraft using redstone, which is incredible. And if you learn how to use redstone really well, that's actually real transferable knowledge that can go across into computer science, into electrical engineering, this type of thing. But the reason that it works is because it's a complex system where there are relationships defined in code between the different concepts, and it allows that push and pull, that experimentation that allows your brain to kind of intuit the rules of the system. It's not just a bunch of facts that will map onto things in the real world. And you can probably see how this is so much more powerful, but also much harder to do. So just to clarify, because these three concepts kind of get a little bit murky together. Intuitive education games, as I said before, fun is the main focus and learning happens as a side effect. Traditional educational games, learning is the main focus. They're sometimes fun if they manage to pull off things well. Not often that happens. And there's a third category of things which I'd refer to as simulations, and they kind of walk a fine line between the two types of educational games by providing a realistic simulation of real-world conditions, right? So I'd say Microsoft Flight Simulator is a perfect example of this. And one of the problems with simulations is that you might find it really enjoyable if you're really interested in the thing that it's simulating, right? If you're interested in flying a plane or becoming a pilot, amateur pilot, whatever, you might find Flight Simulator really fascinating. But if you're not into that kind of stuff, it's probably not really fun as a game, because there's not that attempt to create those kind of gamey elements beyond just what the actual real world system is. We're just trying to emulate it as closely as possible. So I've described, knowledge and understanding as these two different ways to approach intuitive education elements, but they're both kind of quite general and high level. So I'd like to get into the nitty-gritty kind of specifics of how we could actually procedurally implement these features in a game. How do we actually create intuitive education games from either from scratch or integrating them into existing systems? And it is important to realize that you don't have to do this stuff from scratch. You can actually put intuitive education elements into a game that you're already creating or that you've already put out and you want to make an update to, right? The one most important fundamental thing that you need to do is just observe every time you need to create a new system or a new set of concepts specifically in your game. So if you need to create a new mini game, if you need to create a new kind of set of mechanics for a boss fight, if you need to create, say, like 20 new herbs in a new zone in your game because you gather them to make potions and that kind of stuff. Whenever you have to create a set of concepts or a new system, that's a perfect chance to examine, could I do an intuitive education element here? Could I insert a real world concept or system here instead of an invented one? So we'll start off with an example of a knowledge-based system. So say you're creating a game where the player can cast spells, right? And the way that you cast spells is you use runes. And runes can be combined together with other runes to make more complex spells. And say runes, like there's a fire rune and a frost rune and that type of stuff. And it's probably really tempting at this point to invent your own new system of really cool runes. You can get your artist to draw some really nice, simple, symbolic designs, and they can fit the lore of your world, all of that kind of stuff. But this is a perfect example. You're creating a new set of things and a set of combinations of things. This is an example of a time when you could consider using an intuitive education element. So what if we look at what the set of things actually is? Okay, so we have pictographic elements, our runes that represent fire, frost, or that kind of thing, and they can be combined together to create kind of compound things. Why not use, say, Chinese characters? If most of your player base is going to be English speaking, this could be a new intuitive education opportunity for them. Instead of using runes, you could use the real Chinese characters, the Chinese character for fire, the Chinese character for frost, and you could actually do some basic, like real accurate compound words, 2-character words, 3-character words, that type of stuff. The player doesn't need to know how to pronounce them, or even necessarily the exact accurate dictionary meaning. But the thing is that you've got to remember that if a player's playing your game and you've invented a system of runes, they have to learn that system anyway, right? They have to learn the combinations. They have to learn the runes anyway. They're learning a new system regardless of whether you use something invented or something that exists, because if they don't know Chinese and they don't know your runes, it's kind of all the same to them, right? So you're not actually putting any additional burden onto the player to put this type of element in, but they're getting something a little bit extra and special out of it that they might not even realize. Later down the track, they might try to learn Chinese or go on a trip to a country that uses Chinese characters and suddenly be shocked at the fact that they just know that one is fire for some reason. So let's look at an understanding-based example. As I said before, these are much more subtle and difficult to implement and to pull off well, and it requires kind of thinking at a really deep level about the core mechanics and the systems in your game. So say you're making a fighting game like Tekken or Mortal Kombat, right? If we look at fighting games and we strip back all of the extraneous stuff, all the graphics, all the sound, all of the lore, and we go even deeper down, we strip away even the concept of attacks, blocking, positioning, what do we end up with? Well, at the very, very base fundamental level, when we just look at the inputs and the data transformations, fighting games are just about timing, right? They're about you inputting a timing of different buttons that is counted by the game system as superior to your opponent's timing of buttons, right? If you both do the same attack and you time your attack earlier, you win, right? If they do an attack and you time your block correctly, you can block their attack, right? So given that fighting games are all about timing at the very base level, what other systems are there in the world that are about timing, right? That's how you do it. You figure out what the base system is, what is it at the core level, and then what other systems exist in the real world that are based on those same kind of concepts. So in this case, what if we chose music? Music is all about timing, right? So what if we align the timing of the game with the music on the current stage that you're fighting on, right? So that moves are stronger if you're perfectly on the beat, or if they could fail or stumble if you're out of time, right? You could actually subconsciously train the players to have a really, really strong sense of rhythm without making it a rhythm game, right? It's just a subconscious aspect of this particular fighting game. It probably wouldn't necessarily even end up feeling that different to a regular fighting game, because I'm sure that when people are trying to execute complex moves in fighting games, they have some internal sense of rhythm or timing in their head anyway. It helps you remember this stuff, and we're intrinsically rhythmic as people, right? Thinking deeply about this kind of stuff can help you understand your game and how it applies to real world situations, and then potentially adopt a real system. Here's another example. What if we go one level higher and we think of fighting games as, okay, well, sure, they're about timing, but more specifically than that, they're about attacking, blocking, and positioning, right? The three base important elements of fighting games. So say we looked specifically at just attacks, right? Fighting games in terms of attacks are all about combos, right? What if combos, what is it about combos that actually makes them combos, right? What is the base system that is actually going on there? And when you think about it, it's like, okay, we can combine moves together in a specific order, and combos have some shared parts. Like there might be 5 different combos that start with the same 3 moves and then have a different kind of ending. If we look at a system of combining things together in a specific order, what kind of stuff like that exists in the real world? Well, what about grammar? the grammar of a human language, human spoken language, like English or Spanish, whatever. What if you classified all the moves that your fighter has as verbs and nouns or adjectives, right? And high kicks could be future tense, mid kicks could be present tense, low kicks, past tense, for example, for verbs. You could design the combos in the game in a way where you subconsciously pick up the correct grammatical ordering of words in a language, because the only way that you can do a combo is by putting the words in the right order. And you don't have to have it so on the nose about it being like specifically words. The whole point is that you can make it align with a system that you would have had to create in your game anyway, right? Regardless of whether players are learning the combo grammar order or the combo order that you just invented for your game, they still have to learn the combos, right? They have to learn an arbitrary system of combos of moves. So why not give them something a little bit extra with the investment that they're making to learn the systems in your game? By using a real-world system, right, you get all of the richness and the complexity of that system for free. You don't have to invent all of this stuff yourself from scratch, right? You don't have to invent all the combos from scratch. And I think when people think about this, they think about it as costing something to try and align it well with a real-world system. But sometimes, rather than constraining you, integrating these intuitive education concepts actually opens up possibilities for your game design that didn't exist before, right? If your fighting game now has a rhythmic element to it, suddenly the music for the particular stage that you're fighting on is really important, right? It has a big impact on the pace and the difficulty of your fight. As a player, you might be much more comfortable on stages with fast music than slow music. And suddenly now you have an incentive for when players are fighting each other to vote on what stages they want to play, right? And to learn how to play at different rhythmic intervals becomes part of the strategy that wasn't there before. And if the combo ordering, for example, is based on the grammar of a language, you could have playable fighters from lots of different countries, as many of these fighting games do. Tekken, for example, has characters from all different countries, right? And you can have each fighter having a different combo style based on the grammar rules from their native language, right? You have your Korean character who does Taekwondo, and their combos might use Korean grammatical ordering. And then you might have your Brazilian fighter who's doing capoeira, and their combo system might be based on Portuguese instead. And when you think about it from this perspective, you realize like, oh, now I don't actually have to think about inventing all these combos, right? I just have to look at the grammar for Korean and the grammar for Portuguese, and I can just use that to lead the way that the moves will knit together into a combo. It unlocks this richness and this vast corpus of ideas that have been refined over a very long period of time that you don't have to invent yourself from scratch, right? Inventing your own system for your game is incredibly fun and rewarding, and I don't discourage you from doing it at all. So there are some amazing things that have been invented specifically for games that don't exist at all in the real world, things like Portal, for example. But it is important to mention that inventing this stuff can also be very difficult and time-consuming, and just think about the fact that you may actually save time and end up with a better result if you try and align your system with something that already exists in the real world rather than trying to invent something new from scratch. So that's an overview of intuitive education games and the kind of things that you can think about when integrating the mechanics. And I just want to quickly talk about some ethical concerns with this type of game in general, because I think it's really important whenever we're thinking about perhaps a step forward or some new type of thing in technology. These things are very rarely one-sided positives, right? There's always kind of like a way that this sort of stuff can be abused. So firstly, it's really important to acknowledge that intuitive education games, if they're really done well, can kind of be interpreted as a form of subliminal messaging, right? it's actually not possible to resist that information going into your brain. I mean, the example of, I can remember the Tukonu from 20 years ago. You know, it's actually crazy that it's stuck that hard into my brain. So it's really important to just think about the fact that you're kind of doing this without consent, and you should really try and do it ethically in a way that can only benefit the user or the player. The second thing is, it's possible that as we work down this path, we will discover some psychological phenomena about the way that human brains work to make that information transfer much more efficient. And you can already tell that kind of stuff has a high potential for abuse, right? Game companies have actually been at the forefront of discovering kind of bugs in the way that our brains work in order to enhance the addictiveness of games, to make people more likely to spend money on microtransactions. So it's really important to understand the ethical implications of the research that you're doing and how that research is disseminated and framed, right? And the third thing, of course, is that there are industries adjacent to games that are all about exploiting these types of weaknesses. So if we figure out really effective ways to do this type of thing, we have to be really careful with how these games intersect with advertising, you know, with government propaganda, that type of thing, because we really don't want games to turn into these engines of subconsciously inserting ideas into people's minds. And the last ethical thing to think about is that it is incredibly important that when you align your game with a real-world system, you align it accurately, honestly, and truthfully, right? And what I mean by that is, if you put a system into your game that is close to a real-world system but has some inaccuracies or misrepresentations, you risk actually creating or entrenching misinformation in the minds of your players, in the subconscious, right? A great example of this is there are a lot of games that use kind of percentage chance, turn-based games, that kind of stuff. You know, you can take a shot at someone and have a 90% chance to hit. There are a lot of these games that don't represent that probability accurately. And the reason that they don't do that is because we have some cognitive bias around probability. And if you take a shot that has a 90% chance to hit, you kind of assume that it's going to hit every time. Whereas if you're playing a game and you're taking thousands of shots, it's actually not, you know, too unlikely that you'll have several misses in a row at some point on a 90% chance. And if that happens, your brain will perceive that as incorrect, like the probability is broken or something. And so what games have done is they've actually said, okay, well, if you're taking a 90% chance of having something good happen, we'll actually secretly represent that as 99% in the background. So it succeeds much more often than it's supposed to. And if you have a 10% chance of a really bad thing happening, we might lower that down secretly to 1% in the background, so that happens much less often, because that creates a more satisfying experience. It makes people feel like they're getting a better payoff on the risks that they're taking than they actually deserve, right? It's like giving someone an artificial lucky streak in a casino, right? It breaks their brain's interpretation of what probability should be. And you can basically poison a player's subconscious by doing this, because then they're going to take their perception, their skewed perception of probability out into the real world and potentially make misinformed decisions in terms of taking risks, because they perceive probability intuitively incorrectly. It's off base compared to the actual reality. So it's really important to understand that it needs to be accurate and truthful. If you can't make it work and you can't make it fun without making it inaccurate, just can the whole thing and invent your own system. Invent a fantasy system. Don't poison someone's perception of a real world system if you can't make it fun. So just to wrap up, the main things that make an intuitive education game is, firstly, the player needs to learn some kind of real world skill or knowledge as a result of playing the game. And the second thing is, the main focus of the game shouldn't be learning that skill, right? The game itself needs to be fun and engaging as a standalone thing, even if the player isn't interested in learning that skill at all. They should be able to come and play your game and still have a good time, even if they have no interest in learning that skill or knowledge, right? And if you want to really know if you've nailed it, don't mention the educational aspect in the marketing or description of your game at all. See if you can make a popular game with these intuitive education aspects without even mentioning it. That is really hard. I still can't do that. Not yet. So thank you for watching. I should mention that I make intuitive education games. I'm trying to get better at making them and understand more deeply how they work. I have one out at the moment called Matcha. It's a simple kind of tile-based puzzle game, and it's based on the Korean writing system Hangul. So when you finish the game, when you beat all 380 levels or whatever, you should be able to read Korean writing. You won't know what the words mean, but you'll be able to read them. So I've tried to align my in-game system with the Korean writing system and still make it fun. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and go out and make some intuitive education games. Thanks.